The early 1900s was a time in which a widespread feeling of social dislocation caused by widening class divisions and the creation of a large industrial proletariat in the context of capitalist modernity was really prevalent. In the same article cited before, a headline and subsequent passage reads, "Class hatred seeds sown. The seeds of class hatred are sown in a picture of a mob of French waiters on a strike. They are discovered brawling in a barroom, and they tumble forth to go drunkenly through the streets, waving such banners as 'Down with the bosses' and 'The strike forever.'" Films such as these were, unsurprisingly, demonized by the press, which viewed them as dangerous for challenging the effectiveness of industrial capitalism. The reason there was so much concern over films' potential to radicalize viewers was because the lower class were deemed, as stated previously, impressionable and uneducated. If the lower class audience were subjected to films which included anti-capitalist rhetoric, they could, in theory, be inspired to emulate the striking or revolting workers on screen. Maybe they're onto something there. This would pose a great threat to the elites who relied on the vast majority of the country's working class population as the means of production in their capitalist system. A large-scale proletariat revolt would have catastrophic results for those in charge if it were to occur. Catastrophic only from their point of view. Such films being shown in the labouring man's university, as cinema would soon be coined, would be sure to cause such a reaction at some stage. It was for this reason, as well as ensuring films would not mock or criticise other authoritative figures, that it was suggested that films should resist venturing into political topics of any kind. Showing politically charged films to audiences not composed of people of culture and refinement was seen as dangerous. Legal decisions, and those internal to the mainstream film industry, gradually established a consensus that mainstream cinema should principally offer harmless and culturally affirmative entertainment, and that cinema should be defined and should function as a space apart from the political sphere. That is, of course, the film is pro-capitalist or pro-American. Surprise, surprise. With nativism still being a somewhat common attitude at the turn of the century, thought was given into using the powerful medium of the motion picture in order to instill American values in the lower class immigrant communities. At this point, it was clear that immigration couldn't be stopped. The one blood battle, as mentioned earlier, was lost, but the goal of one mind was believed to still be attainable. And I think to some Americans, especially worryingly, it still is. Rhetoric on the educational potential of cinema drew on period conceptions of the function of education in both moulding a moral and responsible citizenry, particularly in Americanizing immigrant groups. This sentiment can be seen as somewhat as a precursor to the thinking of Daniel Lord, the writer of the Production Code, who later urged filmmakers to create films filled with stories of business, industry, and commerce. The constant and powerful rhetoric of the press began to have an effect in 1909 when the National Board of Censorship was formed. The purpose of the board was to encourage positive and acceptable films to be created and dissuade studios from making content which could be viewed as controversial or immoral. In the subsequent decade, the discussion about film censorship began to intensify. One of the prevailing voices in this debate was that of director David Wark Griffith. Before I continue, it should be noted that this dude, despite his championing of anti-censorship sentiment in early cinema, is definitely not someone to be idolised or revered, as will soon become apparent. He had some questionable views, and he produced some equally questionable work. But we'll get to that. One of the most well-known directors from the early 20th century, Griffith is credited as one of the fathers of modern cinema, being the first to utilise numerous techniques which are still in use today. In 1916, he authored a short book titled The Rise and Fall of Free Speech in America. In it, he details arguments against the concept of censorship and censorship's implementation into the film industry. In one of his opening points, he states, "They tell us we cannot show crime in a motion picture. We cannot listen to such nonsense. Had modern censors existed in past ages and followed their theories to logical conclusion, there would have been written no Iliad of Homer. There would have not been written for the glory of the human race that grand cadence of uplift called the Bible. There would have been no Goethe. There would have been no thrilling, beautiful dramas given us as the grandest heritage of the English-speaking race, the plays of Shakespeare." In the same vein, John Collier, the General Secretary of the Board of Censorship, stated, "To eliminate all murders would be to eliminate Shakespeare and nearly all the classical drama, which would be absurd." Griffith also extensively cites an article from from the Saturday Evening Post, which argues that if the printing press were a modern invention, such as a motion picture, it too would be subjected to censorship, which goes against the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. He also points out that censorship of violence in film is unfair, as violence is regularly depicted in newspapers and books and depicted on stage during plays. This, however, interestingly, illustrates exactly one of the reasons censors were looking to specifically censor films. Reading literature and attending plays is synonymous with the immigrant working class, and therefore was not seen as a legitimate threat which could corrupt the minds of those who indulged in such pastimes. Although not addressed specifically in the article, this distinction of class being a major factor in the debate is touched on. Griffith himself also raises the question of class in the debate. If this ordinance be legal, then a similar ordinance in respect to newspapers and the theatres generally would be legal. Are you of opinion that you should have any power such as that? If so, you should probably begin with the newspapers and the so-called high-class theatres. Griffith also writes that censorship infers a lack of intelligence. The intelligence of the general public was very much a central topic of the censorship debate. Griffith obviously having a higher level of faith in audiences than his adversaries. Furthermore, he raises a point which would be echoed with the introduction of the production code, in which two men decided what constituted moral and immoral on behalf of the entire United States. What is an immoral picture or film? Who can answer that question? Must that question be answered for 100 million people by 5 men whom they did not choose? Ironically, 14 years later, the question to Griffith's hypothetical question would be Martin Quigley and Daniel Lord, the two men who created the production code and made that decision on behalf of every single person in America. Now, like I said earlier, it is worth mentioning that one of the catalysts for Griffith writing this book was the censorship endured by his film Birth of a Nation, the original title of which revealingly was The Klansman. So the film was, at the time, and still is, highly controversial for its negative depiction of African Americans and its glorification of the Ku Klux Klan. So as a result, there were many calls to ban the film. The film is also credited with helping with the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan as the second Klan, which was started up soon after the film's release. That looks familiar. Despite the compelling argument made against censorship in The Rise and Fall of Free Speech in America, it should be remembered that its author held some views which were reprehensible and inexcusable. Griffith also argues in his book about film's potential to be used as an educational tool. It's ignorance that makes possible the terrible waves of hatred that have caused our many wars and murders, inspired by politics, religion, and all the various other causes. This is the reason for the teachings of history. 6 moving pictures would give these students more knowledge of the history of the world than they have obtained from their entire study. While this statement is undoubtedly correct, if not slightly ironic coming from a man who is undoubtedly intolerant and racist himself, Griffith fails to observe the filmic medium's potential to be hijacked for propaganda purposes, which it was, to devastating effect, only a few years later during the Nazi Party's vilification and then subsequent extermination of the Jews that began in 1930s Germany. It's also worth noting that Griffith's book features cartoons on every second page, depicting the personification of censorship as a small balding man with a long hooked nose. It's unclear whether this cartoon character is known as drawn this way as like a comical, sticking your nose into other people's business joke, or if Griffith himself is engaging in anti-Semitism, implying that implicating Jews in a conspiracy to censor the film industry, or both. It is noted that Griffith's admiration of the Ku Klux Klan could be viewed in alignment with anti-Semitism, a rhetoric which was popular with the Klan. Anti-Semitism was steadily on the rise in the early 20th century, examples of which are, so in 1920, newspapers published a headline that read, "The lobby of the International Reforms Bureau, Dr. Wilbur Crafts, presiding, voted tonight to rescue the motion pictures from the hands of the devil and 500 unchristian Jews." 6 years later, William Chase, the rector of a Protestant church, and William Short, executive director of the Motion Picture Research Council, and over 200 women's organization representatives marched on Washington demanding federal regulation of movies. Chase condemned the Hebrew owners and producers as vile corruptors of American morals. It's clear that anti-Semitism was a problem that permeated early 20th century America's society, and it cannot be ruled out that Griffith himself was not engaging in such beliefs. I actually looked into this aspect of the book, and I inquired with my lecturers when I was writing my dissertation, and none of us could actually find any definitive answer. So if any of you actually know more about it, I'd love to hear about it in the comment section, and learn a bit more about that kind of aspect of Griffith and his writing. So the 1920s were a time of great change in the film industry. In 1921, the 13 points were introduced as an attempt to improve the moral standard of films. In 1922, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, the MPPDA, was formed, and a conservative Republican politician, William H. Hayes, was elected as its inaugural president. In 1927, Hayes introduced his Don'ts and Be Carefuls, which were another attempt at cleaning up Hollywood. This was a list of things that were outright banned on screen, and then a further list of topics which should be treated with caution. Finally, in 1930, with the help of two men, Father Daniel Lord and Catholic journalist Martin Quigley, Hayes produced the Motion Picture Production Code. This, in the mind of Hayes, would be the self-censorship code to end all self-censorship code. So the code was an extensive document which expanded on the previous Don'ts and Be Carefuls. It was adopted by the MPPDA that year, and writers and producers were expected to abide by its rules, which they didn't. Over the next few years, producers would just continue to make films based on subjects which were most popular, and in the early 30s these topics were often amongst those which were prohibited by the production code. Despite the code's existence, it had done little to improve the moral quality of cinema. It was simply being ignored by literally everyone. In 1934, a group of ministers and laymen from the Catholic Church decided that they had had enough. In their minds, something had to be done, and they were about to make their voices heard, changing the trajectory of the film industry on a massive scale. So my original plan was to convert my entire dissertation into like a nearly feature-length video essay, but me, myself, and my raging ADHD decided that it would be better to split the video into 4 chapters rather than like a feature-length extravaganza. So as such, this is hopefully going to be the first installment of a 4-part series on this topic. In the next section, we'll go on to look at the influence of the Catholic Church and the production code that it had on American cinema in the mid-20th century. Following that, we'll look at Hollywood after the fall of the production code and the introduction of the rating system, which we know and love today, and how controversial classics such as A Clockwork Orange, The Exorcist, and Natural Born Killers came to galvanize the press and the public. And then finally, in the last part, we'll come to cover the most controversial film of the last few years, Joker. We'll look at the controversy surrounding the film, the preemptive media backlash, and what can really be done to address the fears that critics raise around the dangers of depicting violence or controversial themes within films. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you like it, or don't. It's up to you. And hopefully I'll see you again soon for a follow-up on this video. Oh god, that was so hard.